There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we start.
Hello, I'm Charlie Swanson, and with me is Stan Taylor, and we're going to be having a conversation about debt, globalization, and the threat to democracy. This is information that was presented by Stan in a teach-in that We the People Eugene had on July 27th of this year. Stan is a lawyer and a political science instructor at Lane Community College. He's also the director of the Lane Peace Center and is active in CALC's community response. I'm also an instructor at Lane Community College. I teach physics and some math. So I would like to allow Stan to just get started and introduce the thesis of what he's going to talk about.
You know, one of the things that's so brilliant about the Occupy movement is their framing of we are the 99%, or alternatively, there is the 1%. And the question always comes about how did that 1% get to be the 1%? And the answer to that is pretty straightforward. It's that in our economic system, most wealth is created through a debt financing process, so that ordinary individuals like you and I are indebted through debt financing of credit cards and mortgages and buying cars and so forth. And governments are indebted in much the same way through loans that they take out to deficit spend on things like the military to be able to continue to operate.
So there's always been the 1%. But what's interesting now is that 1% controls so much more of the wealth than they did even just, say, 30 years ago. I think it's gone from, in just not the wealth, but the income of the 1% was on the order of 9% of the total national income, total personal income. And that's changed in the last 30 years to become something like 23 or 24% of the total national income. So the 1% has become incredibly much more powerful, say 3 times more powerful just within the last 3 decades.
At least, and really it's the last 3 decades since the 1970s that debt as a means of organizing the economy has become primary.
And so the debt to the government, it wouldn't necessarily need to have been if we had in other words, the government would not need to have gone into so much debt if we had a tax structure that taxed probably similar to what it did from, say, the mid-1930s until the 1970s or even beginning of the 1980s, where we had a much more progressive personal income tax system. And in the 50s, we had a much higher proportion of the national budget being paid for by corporate taxes rather than just personal income taxes. So it is part of the reason debt's become so much more important is because of the tax structure change.
That's correct. Yeah. You know, it was in the 1970s that Nixon made a crucial choice about how our political power would be manifested in the world as a nation. He decided at the early part of the 1970s, when the economy was in a downturn, that it was time to attach U.S. political power to global finance and away from manufacturing.
So why did he decide that manufacturing was not very important for the United States at that point? Do you know?
Well, it was a critical junction. If you think about the period after World War II, where the Bretton Woods agreements were set up and the global economic system was set up at that point, the United States was the only industrial country left standing at that point. And we essentially, through the Marshall Plan and the Douglas Plan, helped Europe and Japan rebuild from the mid-1940s through the end of the 1960s. But what had happened by the end of the 1960s is that Europe and Japan had rebuilt, but they'd rebuilt with better technology so that they were producing products, better products, for less money.
Because our infrastructure at the time, our industry was actually using older facilities, and it wasn't valuable to them at that point to necessarily
There was two
provide
reasons.
new.
One was that the technology we were using in our own facilities hadn't been upgraded, so that we were producing. We were at a competitive disadvantage in terms of the production facilities. And that was amplified by the fact that at the end of World War II, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the currencies between the United States, Europe, and Japan had been fixed. So not only were we producing fewer goods for the same amount of money, but they were inferior goods as well. And that meant that when you looked at the international trading system, that our companies that produced their products within the boundaries of the United States and then shipped them abroad, they were uncompetitive. And so Nixon had a choice in the early 1970s to either put U.S. tax dollars back into rebuilding manufacturing in this country, or to tie U.S. political power to the banks themselves.
So was it mostly a choice made because it was not that expensive to, in the immediate term, to allow the banks to become competitive, where it would have been fairly expensive to put enough money to let our industry become competitive again?
I think there were a variety of reasons. That certainly is one of them. But the early 1970s were a kind of turning point. I think really is the crucial decade in terms of a change in the nature of politics and economics in this country, and globally as well. So in the early 1970s, not only did the economy take a downturn because we were becoming uncompetitive, but the computer became dominant in the 1970s. And it, for the first time, allowed firms to track their inventory on a global scale. And so it became possible for corporations to move from being domestic corporations, producing their products inside their own home country, and then shipping them abroad in international trade, to become multinational corporations. So they put their production facilities in multiple countries and then tracked their inventory using the computer. And so in the early 1970s, we see this change in the nature of corporations from being domestic corporations to being multinational corporations, and hence harder to control by their own governments. Also in the early 1970s, we had the OPEC oil cartel being formed. And the OPEC oil cartel was a cartel of oil-producing countries that set quotas on the amount of production that they were going to produce in terms of oil, which reduced the supply of oil and caused the price of oil to increase dramatically. And so the cost of energy were going up at the same time.
So has that made it more valuable to produce in a variety of countries, so you didn't have to ship it, or did it the production in many other countries and shipping back to the United States, that might seem like it would have cost more money because the oil was more expensive?
Well, for a variety of reasons. One is, of course, that you could produce and sell where you were producing, but it was also true that you could produce in countries that had very low standards in terms of labor standards and environmental standards, so that the cost of labor was extraordinarily cheap, which then gave you an advantage in terms of the production of products, and which, of course, is part of why labor unions began their drastic decline in the early 1970s, towards today.
So you've mentioned the rise of debt, and so could you maybe go into a little bit more of how that's been used to undermine democracy?
Well, it's interesting. It's happened in a couple of different ways, and I need to kind of do a big historical narrative here to kind of get this out.
Yeah, that'd probably be good to have some background.
So when the Bretton Woods agreements were put into place in 1944, they set up a system of global trade that was based upon comparative advantage. And theoretically, what was supposed to happen is each nation was supposed to produce what they produced best, and as an efficient producer, they could trade it on the world market. And if everybody produced what they produced best and traded on the world market, theoretically, this would work for all countries.
And so that economic notion that the more efficient production, I guess, and so in essence, free trade is good. It's really based on the notion that more production is good. So if we don't think that lack of production is our economic problem, it doesn't seem to be a solution for anything. It's only a solution for lack of production, I would think.
Well, of course, in the time that the Bretton Woods was set up, lack of production was a problem for all of Europe and for Japan and for most of the emerging third world. I mean, they were still basically in a pre-modern stage of development. And so there was a lot of room for increased production to serve a vastly increased population for things.
So it made sense then at that time to think of we are solving a problem, this lack of production, by making more efficient production. So that argument might have been reasonable at the time.
Certainly, I think that many policymakers thought it was reasonable at the time. If you look at Europe in that period of time, most of the European countries were socialist in their orientation. And if you look at the United States, we were in the midst of the, FDR, New Deal, Democratic coalition that was providing for a kind of social orientation towards government, towards people. And so there was a sense that capital in the form of manufacturing and industrial production led to the opportunity to garner the wealth that you needed to be able to return services to people. And so there was at least some of the stated motives were around in those frameworks. Of course, there's some very heavy assumptions that are being made there that the people of the newly emerging third world, that their way of life is backward, that it's something in need of improvement, and that really the assumption was that you needed to get rid of the old traditional tribal, clan, religious frameworks and move towards a secular, urban manufacturing framework. So it had tremendous disruptive impacts on the third world.
But it did probably increase their production. One of the ironic things is probably that increased production didn't actually allow many of those produced goods to stay where it was being produced in the form of the third world.
That's true. Most of them came back to the first world. And on top of that, if you look at how the projects that took place in the third world were developed, they usually involved loans coming from first world banks through the World Bank itself.
So this is where the debt comes in.
Yeah. So debt begins to come into the mix. And those loans usually had conditions that the contractors that were hired to build a road or construct a dam or some other type of engineering project were usually United States companies or European companies that were actually going in and doing the work. So not only did the goods and proceeds come the United States way, but the actual work that was being done wasn't being done by third world peoples for their own benefit, but was being done by first world companies where the people who were being paid were first world contractors. Right? So,
but I mean, the labor was probably mostly third world labor, but it was contracted through first world companies. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Think of how even today, think about what happened in Iraq with all the contracting that took place in Iraq, done by United States companies, but hiring labor from around the world that was extraordinarily cheap to do the work. Right? But the vast bulk of the profits and proceeds come back to the corporate coffers in that framework.
So, in some sense, the corporations that were doing this, going abroad to do this production, were not worried about selling what they were producing to the locals to a very large extent. So in the notion that Henry Ford had, where he wanted to actually raise the wages of the people making his cars for Ford Motor Company so that they could actually buy the cars they were making, that didn't seem to come into play very much for most of these companies.
No, it's mostly elites and a small, contingent around the elites that benefited from the contracts that were being awarded in those countries. But it's even more ironic than that if you move forward to later times, because at a certain point in time it becomes clear that it's not even important whether the projects themselves are successful, because if you think about it in a debt framework where you're creating a project that creates debt that the countries then have to repay, when it gets to the point of time where they can't repay those debts, then you're in a position to step in and put conditions on any kind of extension of the loan or increases of the loan. And so you begin to get what's called structural adjustment programs being imposed. And now I'm kind of moving forward in time pretty rapidly, but what you see is that in the 1960s, there was some amount of loans that took place, but in the 1970s, a lot of loans took place, and that's because when the OPEC oil cartel got put into place and the cost of oil went through the roof, those countries that were the OPEC countries, they got really rich very quickly. And after they'd spent what they wanted to spend on all sorts of things, they still had huge amounts of money that they took and deposited in first world banks. But for the rest of the third world that was modernizing, that had become dependent on oil as their primary energy resource, they suddenly found themselves in a terrible circumstance because the cost of energy became very high, and in order to continue to modernize, they needed that oil. And so what they did was they got very low interest rate loans from first world banks to buy oil to continue to modernize. And so the 70s saw an incredible increase in the amount of debt for third world countries. And that worked fine until the early 1980s when there was a worldwide recession. And in that recession, that meant that first world countries cut back drastically on the amount of goods they were purchasing from third world countries. And suddenly we had a global debt crisis for the third world.
Meaning that those third world countries could no longer service the debts, and so
Right.
and they were being called upon by the first world countries to pay it back at the time.
Right. So when the first world cut back on their buying of products from the third world, then the amount of proceeds that were revenue that was being generated to service the loans fell. And it fell below the point where they could actually service the loans, so they found themselves in national debt crises. And this was a crisis not only for the third world countries, but for the banks themselves, which potentially saw default for these loans coming
So
in.
the third world countries were not only producing goods which were mostly sold to the first world and not seeing much of the profit of them, but now they were going into debt to do so, and in order to go into debt, they were taking the loans from the first world countries, and they were forced to pay interest on these debts to the first world countries. So they were not only losing the goods that were being produced, but they're also having to pay extra money for the privilege of doing so.
And it gets much worse, because it's in this period of time that the International Monetary Fund's primary function changes from one of currency stabilization to really a middle organization between the banks and the third world countries. And IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is primarily controlled through the United States because the voting power in the International Monetary Funds depends upon the contribution of nation states to it, and the United States is by far the largest contributor. So it's really a policy arm of the United States.
So do you know what percentage of the funding for the IMF during that time came from the U.S.?
A majority.
Majority of it did, okay.
And so what happened with the IMF is they stepped in between the third world countries and the banks, and on behalf of the banks they said, we can negotiate, another loan to you, like a second credit card to service the first credit card. But what will have to happen is, in order for you to get this loan, you have to agree to special conditions, what they called structural adjustment agreements. And the structural adjustment agreements required them to do two things. One is to organize their economy to be export-driven economies. So they would produce industrial-based products that were to be exported north to the first world. So we think about all the fruit and vegetables we get in the winter. That's basically the result of structural adjustment of third world countries that send their products north to us as part of an export-oriented economy. So they're not producing for themselves, they're producing for the first world. Right? And second, they said that you have to also cut back on your social spending. Dollars that you previously brought in taxes for things like education and health care have to be reduced dramatically, and those taxes will then be used to service the loans. So what happens with structural adjustment agreements is countries lose the ability to structure their own economies. So that goes to the International Monetary Fund, and they lose the ability to pass laws that actually provide for the social welfare of their own citizens.
So essentially they lose the democracy of that nation is no longer, the people are no longer able to elect people to pass laws that help themselves.
These countries are no longer sovereign countries, in essence. Right? Somebody else is calling the shots about how they're going to be organized. And it's the banks, basically, through the International Monetary Fund.
So one would think that these countries didn't like this very much. And so are there countries that sort of said just no, or were the leaders so much indebted to this huge amount of money that they kind of forced their citizens to go along with it by despotic means, I guess?
Most found that they would go along with these conditions. Of course, the elites benefit. They get more money from this process than less.
The elites of those countries.
That's right, of those countries. And if a country sought to step outside of the system, essentially what happens is they get ostracized globally. So that all access to any kind of international funds gets cut off, and they wind up basically having to go it alone in the international system. So, like Cuba with the embargo on it, that similar type of process happens to other countries that refuse to continue the indebtedness process.
So Cuba actually had this happen to them earlier for different reasons.
For different reasons, but it's a similar
kind of process. Yeah.
Right?
And Cuba wasn't willing to give up its sovereignty for this. So,
and there are, more recently in South America and Latin America, countries that have begun to step outside of this framework. So if you look at Venezuela with Hugo Chavez and the oil resources they have, they were able to pay off their debts and move outside of the system. And a number of other countries, Argentina and Brazil and others in Latin America, have sought to do the same type of thing to begin to free themselves from this process. So there is a movement to recognize the limitations of what's called neoliberalism, or the Washington Consensus, to try to move out of this framework. But the thing that's important to recognize from this framework is that debt is used as an element of political policy to be able to control other countries through kind of a debt slavery framework where they lose their sovereignty through structural adjustment programs.
Okay, so debt is used as a weapon against democracy for that country.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
It kind of sounds familiar with some of the things that maybe are going on personally with in the United States.
Well, it's a perfect segue for what happened here, because at the exact same time in the 1970s, what you see is as corporations become multinational corporations and move their operations abroad, or their production facilities abroad, what begins to happen in the 1970s is wages in this country begin to stagnate. And so from 1975 forward, essentially wages in the United States have been flat.
So there was, it seemed like there was an effort to maybe stop that politically. At the end of the 1970s, the 1980 election, for example, it seemed like there might have been some political effort in the United States to say, well, do we really want to continue in this direction, or do we want to go back towards more power for labor or more power for the individuals? And it seemed like the choice or the election of Reagan made it so that there was no attempt to go back again.
That's right. I mean, if you look at presidents since Nixon forward, the only president that sought to base U.S. Economics on manufacturing was President Carter. All the other presidents have followed this process of essentially deregulation of the financial industry, and from one president to another, the deregulation has gotten greater and greater until under Bill Clinton, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, which was the last vestige of regulating banks in terms of their operations and how they speculate using their proceeds.
And so not only, I think, at the end of the Clinton administration was the Glass-Steagall repealed, but there was an attempt, I think, in Congress to put forth regulations relating to derivatives. And Rubin and Larry Summers worked very hard to make sure that that was declared illegal to do. Congress was not allowed to regulate derivatives.
That's right. But we're kind of getting our hair set ahead of ourselves a little bit here. Let's take a step back and get back to the early 1970s. We talked about wages being flat, but what wasn't flat from the 1970s forward was productivity of labor. And so what you have from the 1970s forward is wages are flat, but productivity of labor continues to rise dramatically. And historically, when productivity increased, wages increased along with their productivity, so that the worker captured the gains in their own productivity. But
which kind of seems fair.
Seems fair, right? So they're producing more through higher productivity. They get higher wages for it. But beginning in the 1970s, a gap begins to emerge between the wages that are paid and the productivity, and that gap basically winds up being huge profits for corporations. So corporations take that money that previously had been captured by labor, and they're making greater profits than they've ever made any time in history.
And they apparently use some of those profits to pay some of their employees. The chief executive officers, for example, seem to have increased their pay.
That's right.
And a few other people in upper management. So they didn't keep it all as profit for the corporation.
So huge payouts to executives for their compensation, to the point where now the difference between an average worker's pay and an executive's pay is somewhere on the order of 300 to 1, if not more.
And it was on the order of about 50 to 1, I think.
30 to 1.
30 to 1 in the 1970s.
Yeah.
So it's gone from 30 to 1 to 300 to 1. And one might argue that the chief executive officers haven't been that much more useful to corporations than they used to be.
Well, yeah, it's a question, really interesting question. How do you measure the productivity of a CEO?
So another, I would say that perhaps another reason that they're able and willing to do this is that, again, going back to the change in tax structure, when the very, very highest incomes were taxed at 70%, which was the case up until Reagan, you might argue, the corporation might think, well, why should I pay all that much money to my chief executive officer when 70% of it is going to go to the government? And so there wasn't all that much reason to make ridiculous salaries for CEOs at that point.
I think it goes back to the fact that in the early 1970s, we switched from being a manufacturing-based country to one that's really based upon finance. So the connection of the CEO to the actual workers in their own firm that were doing the manufacturing of goods was real prior to the 1970s and became basically an illusion after the 1970s. So I think that's part of it. The other interesting thing is that these huge profits that these corporations made, they had to do something with them, and they didn't just plow them back into increased production. What they did was they said, "Oh, we've got all this money, we can ourselves become finance corporations." Right? So you get General Motors becoming, GMAC as a finance arm, where it's financing the purchases of its automobiles to the laborers that are working in its plants.
So the laborers were not getting an increase in wages, but I think they kept spending money. So how did that work?
Well, that's what happened, is that the wages were replaced with debt, with credit. So you begin to get credit cards being pushed out on everyone. So consumer credit becomes highly, everyone can get a hold of it. I mean, the times where if you're a new student at a university, you're being chased down. Take my credit card.
Yeah,
take my credit
10
card.
of them
Or anybody.
every day. Anybody would get it, yes.
Yeah, in the mail, how many do you get in the mail? Those kinds of questions. And so essentially, one of the things that's interesting is during that period of time where wages and productivity mirrored each other, there was a sense that the more that when you worked and your wages went up, that you could afford to consume more. And so wage increases and consumptions became a norm together. They became something that you expected. And so when the wages became flat and stagnant, the expectation of increased consumption didn't stop. So you had a gap between the actual wages that were being earned and the expectations that you should be able to continue to consume at high levels or ever higher levels. And that gap between demand for product and actual wages was filled with debt. And so we became a very indebted society.
So personally, we became an indebted society because we were borrowing, the wage earners were borrowing to pay for an increasingly comfortable lifestyle because that was what they were used to having, but they were not getting wages to do so.
Mm-hmm. And this brings us to one of the real problems that we face today, is that what you saw from the worker is that they did two things. They took out debt to consume more, and they worked more hours, and more people were in the workforce.
Yeah, and also because women started working much more heavily than they did before, there were many families had more people in the workforce.
Mm-hmm. And so, today we find that compared to 25 years ago, people are working the equivalent of 6 more weeks a year in time than they did, in the 1970s. In essence, we've gone from a nation that worked an average of 40 hours a week to a nation that works an average of 48 hours a week per person, and that works out to 6 weeks a year extra work a year comparatively.
And my understanding is that real wages of the, I think, approximately 100% increase in productivity that's happened since the 70s, or maybe it's more than that. Of that 100% increase in productivity, maybe 1 or 2% has gone to increase in wages for those who are doing most of the work, and the rest of that increase has gone into salaries or profits for the 1%.
That's right. Yeah. So it's it's a mechanism of extracting wealth from the bottom and moving it up to the top, and that's what debt is. I mean, that's what debt does. Because
so it's this is really a form, if you want, of class warfare. It's probably not really warfare, but that might be the way to phrase it in the way some is. And so the choice of the United States, well, perhaps Nixon's administration in the 1970s to make us much more dependent upon finance instead of productive manufacturing, productive industry, made us move from, gave a way for us to move money from the middle class up to the top.
That's right.
Top.
That's right. And the thing that's the limit that we're now reaching today is that first, people can't take out more debt. They're at their max debt loads. They've maxed themselves out in terms of what they could possibly service as debt. And they can't work more hours because they're already working a maximum number of hours.
Well, and in fact, a lot of people couldn't take out debt even if they wanted to because credit has dried up for a number of people, and even for small businesses. I mean, part of the huge financial crisis in 2007 and 8 is a credit crisis that people and small businesses couldn't take out debt, even if they had a good business plan and thought they could service it.
That's true. And the irony of that is that right now interest rates on money are extraordinarily low. And the Federal Reserve has actually been loaning money to the big banks at somewhere between 0 and 1%. And so the banks themselves have more money in their coffers than they've had at any time in history, but they're not loaning it. And the reason they're not loaning is it's not profitable to loan it when it can be used for speculative ventures where the gains are potentially, 20 times what you're borrowing the money of the amount of money you're borrowing for.
What about the losses, though? I mean, if it's speculative, you'd expect that the banks could incur losses.
Well, that's true. That's what the bubbles are all about. And, that's what we've experienced with the mortgage framework is that they leverage the assets to, somewhere between 20 to 100 times their actual value of the assets. And when the bubble burst, in the sense of some people not being able to repay, then all that inflated value slipped out of the economy. And of course, if you're looking at...
And so did the banks suffer because of that?
Well, we bailed them out, right?
Oh, that's right.
And so that's the ultimate backup, is that, for the banks, when they have a bubble burst, what we do is we take money from the public coffers through taxes and give it to the banks to cover their risks.
So the banks were making excessive money, one might say excessive money, by taking these risks, making more money than they might make otherwise. And when the risks failed, they didn't lose the money. They went to the taxpayers and said, well, you got to bail us out, I guess, because we're too big to fail. And so the taxpayers essentially paid the banks for taking the risk, and so the banks did not lose any money.
And the big lie here is that when we bail them out, that they'll turn around and they'll make credit available to help the economy grow by supporting small businesses like you.
And so has that changed now? The banks are...
But they're not doing that,
Oh.
right? They're taking the money and they're speculating. I mean, the latest speculative bubble is around currency speculation. You've probably heard in the news that we've been pressuring China to revalue their currency by as much as 20% upward. And so banks are taking money that the feds have provided to them through a process that the feds call quantitative easing, which is basically the feds creating money out of thin air and giving it to the banks. And the banks are speculating with that money that the value of Chinese currency will rise and that they will make huge amounts of money on that. Now, the mere speculation on currency is causing the value of currency to inflate. So a bubble is being created. And at some point, that bubble will burst again. And so the trend over and over again in an economy that is not attached to the production of real goods and services, that is a speculative economy, is speculative to economies create bubbles, and bubbles burst on a regular basis,
and
requiring another bailout. And, you can take this back. Think back to the 1980s when we deregulated the savings and loan industry, and there was a financial bubble that got created, and we bailed out the savings and loan. You know, it's a repeated thing. The 80s, it was the savings and loan. The 90s, it was the dot-coms. The 2000s, it's the mortgage bubble. Now we're creating another bubble around currency speculation.
So the dot-com bubble was, I think, a little bit different in that not very many of those were big companies that the U.S. taxpayers had to bail out. I mean,
the bailout didn't occur.
The bailout didn't occur. So that's a pretty. I mean, it was a bubble, but it wasn't. It wasn't a taxpayer-financed bailout. At least nowhere near the extent that occurred for the savings and loan or for the current banks.
But if you recall, at the same time, going back to the early part of 2001, when that bubble burst, is that there was a recession in the country. And state governments like here in Oregon wound up not being able to collect enough taxes to pay the bills for their social services, requiring cuts to the social services that never have recovered. And we've gone through cuts after cut after cut that really began when the dot-com bubble burst in the early part of the century.
So in some sense now we're getting, I guess, what would be called structural adjustment for the United States citizens in the first world. So it's no longer being forced upon us by the IMF, but it's being forced upon us by our government saying.
It's the same bunch of people.
Same bunch of people. Okay, so
it's the same bunch of people. If you look at the Treasury Department and its connection to the Federal Reserve, they're the ones who engineered the processes of structural adjustment to third world, and they're engineering the adjustments and the bailouts here in the United States as well.
So they're kind of now using the citizens of the first world countries as a third world country to structurally adjust us and to take away our sovereign rights and our democracy of being able to govern ourselves for the benefit of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And the other interesting thing is how this is connected to militarism as well, because if you look at the debt that the United States has taken on, most of that is deficit spending for military spending, military contractors and fighting these wars that about, is the world safe from terrorism? But the debt financing is primarily through banks. We hear we're indebted to other countries, but if you look at the vast bulk of the debt the United States owes, it's owed to private institutions, banking institutions, right? So even militarism is connected to a debt cycle, and weapons production is connected to a debt cycle. And so all of this, where you begin to talk about fighting wars to produce weapons that are created using debt-financed money, is all part of the same cycle. And of course, that cycle can't end, because if the cycle ends, the financing ends, right? So it's part of the same cycle. So not only we hollow out the country economically, but we passed the Patriot Act, the National Defense Authorization Act that's recently passed, the Homeland Security Department, and we begin to talk about, ending civil liberties as we know them, at the same time that we take away our ability to have jobs that provide any kind of living wage.
So the part of the reason that our government thinks that the Patriot Act is necessary and the National Defense Authorization Act is necessary is because they're afraid that if people wake up to this, they may choose to not go into debt quite so much, and they may choose to not fund the kinds of things that the militaristic things that some of these companies might like to fund, or take money in taxes and use it for the welfare of the people. Is that part of what's going on?
I guess everybody has to draw their own conclusions, but yeah, I think that's part of what's happening. I think we're kind of at a crossroads with both the economic system, with the economic system as a whole, and all the systems that we have. We're at a crossroads because, as we talked about earlier, the debt structure is one that's going to be impossible to service. You can't work more, you can't take out more debt. People are starting to save money instead of take out
bad
more debt.
Things of savings. Huh?
Well, but if an economy is based upon consumption, and then it suggests that this is a crossroads, that we're at. Also, we're at crossroads around issues of energy and global climate change. You know, Naomi Klein recently wrote an article in the Nation magazine about capitalism or climate change. You know, it's a choice. And the thrust of the article was that the reason that there's so much propaganda about climate change not being real and why policymakers and corporate businesses refuse to accept it, is that you can't have business like we have it today, this kind of corporate capitalism like we have it today, and deal with climate change. It's an either or choice. It's not one, it's not both and, it's an either or choice.
There seems to be, in Europe, even the corporations in Europe seem to be more accepting of the fact of climate change. You don't see so many of those companies fighting against it like you do in the United States. And even Germany, for example, is actually making money now because they've become a leader in alternative energy. And so European companies seem to have opened up more to the notion that climate change is real. And certainly insurance companies have. They've changed the way they insure because they're saying that the risks that we have because of climate catastrophes are real, and we need to take those into account. And they actually seem to be changing rates because of that. So some companies are treating it as if it were real.
I think that's true, although I'll be interested to see what happens in Europe as these austerity measures get put into place. You know, one of the things we haven't talked about is the same dynamic happened in Europe. Is about a decade after Nixon made the connection of U.S. political power to finance, Europe began to follow by forming the European Union, and it's a currency union. And what it does is it puts the banks basically in charge of the European Union. And the dilemma that's now happening in European countries is that they've gotten themselves into a debt crisis, and they're calling them austerity measures, but they're essentially structural adjustment measures. And what they're being told is we have to give up large amounts of sovereignty to basically the banks to manage those countries, in ways that deal with economic realities. You know, it's exactly the same dynamic, and it's global capital that's basically stepping in, financial capital that's basically stepping in to organize how countries are run.
So as we're bumping up against this, debt financing. It seems like the capitalists, the financial institutions, must realize that we're getting pretty close to the limit here, that there just is no more debt that's going to happen. So do they have any plans for a way out, or are they just going to keep going until it collapses?
It's a good question. I'm not sure that they have plans for a way out. What seems to be happening now is this effort to take total control of things, and to control more and more aspects of things, and to garner as much of the wealth into their own pockets as possible in the process. The one factor we haven't talked about as another factor why this system can't continue is peak oil and energy descent. And that is around 2005, it's pretty clear the world reached its peak in terms of oil production, and we've been at a kind of plateau where they're trying as hard as they can to push more and more oil out of the ground, and production levels are not going up. They're actually beginning to go down. And that means we're entered into an energy descent world. And in an energy descent world, it means categorically that economies will not grow. And this goes back then to the problem for a debt-based economy, because loans, debt by their nature, are given under the premise that there will be growth that can be used to repay the interest and the principal on the loan. And if you can't grow, you can't earn the funds to make the payments to repay. And so fundamentally, we're reaching limits to the system. And the alternatives really are really different types of systems, where you're basically putting more people, relocalizing and putting more people back to work, doing kind of basic things that allow them to be more self-sufficient in the particular region in which they live.
I mean, we certainly seem to have a lot of people in the United States and around the world that are willing to work that are not working right now, and it seems like there's a lot of things a lot of jobs that could be done. You mentioned the fact that economies are going to have to decrease in size because of the energy, but there's quite a few things where you could substitute human power for energy use, and you would think that maybe we would be looking at these things a little bit more and say, okay, well, we aren't going to have so much energy, so now let's see what humans can do to make it so we can still have a pretty reasonable economy without that much energy. Are we making any progress on that, or are we, how are we going to maybe transition to something of that nature?
Well, I think there's a lot of progress being made on those kinds of initiatives. And here in the Willamette Valley, the Willamette Valley Food and Farm Coalition is a good example of that process where farmers are growing local organic food and setting up alternative market mechanisms to get it to market to consumers. And increasingly that involves more human beings doing work directly on the land to produce the food to make that happen. And that's the kind of model that is going to be the model for almost all types of production. And similarly, the fastest growing segment of the economy is cooperatives as a form of business. And cooperatives tend to be more democratic in their orientation in terms of their management, and they tend to be much more self-conscious about how goods are produced and how far away they are that they're being produced and so forth. So there's a lot to be optimistic about.
So people are taking it to some extent in their hands. Is there a way that we can get our government to go along with this and help the process rather than it seemingly hinder the process?
Well, that's the interesting question, and it goes back to the last program where we were talking about basically restructuring the economy through ending corporate personhood and beginning to return the power to govern ourselves back to ordinary, natural people instead of corporations. That's the trend, that's the need, because as long as government is controlled, and I think right now it is controlled by corporations, we're not going to see a change in this kind of policy.
So going back historically to the 1800s, Marx sort of suggested that capitalism was going to come to a crisis, that his historical analysis suggested that capitalism was absolutely necessary to get us to be productive enough, to be, wealthy enough as a country, as a world, to provide well for the people of the world. Capitalism has seemed to do that to some extent. It certainly had a very unequal distribution. There's lots of places where it doesn't seem to have done that. But in the United States, most people live pretty well, and it has worked pretty well. But Marx foresaw that capitalism was going to have crises. And he was really thinking mostly about manufacturing sort of capitalism. It was going to have crises, and eventually it was going to have so many it was essentially going to implode on itself. It seems like perhaps the shift to financial corporations rather than manufacturing has maybe moved us along further towards that collapse. Do you want to maybe comment on that a little bit?
Well, I think Marx was very brilliant in his assessment of how capital, the flaws with capital, how it would concentrate on fewer and fewer hands, and at some point where you begin to look at the system, it would essentially not be a true market-based system, in the sense that we think of capitalism as at least the mythology of capitalism is that it's one of competition between different producers, and that competition produces an optimal outcome in a free market. But the reality is that increasingly there are fewer and fewer producers, and that the market itself, not only is production itself structured in a way where it's controlled, but distribution is now being controlled as well. So the market is no longer one that's competitive, it's one that's itself fully planned as a market, both in terms of production and distribution. And that at that point you're looking at a point at which it's conceivable that if the means of production were utilized to take care of people's needs, where the planning process is not one to maximize profits, but to actually meet people's actual needs, that you could use those industrial processes, the factories, to actually meet the needs of the people. So the potential is there, but the step to where you can get to where it's being redirected in those ways is not yet happening. So there's it's clear that we have the ability, if you take the production facilities we have in the world and use them to meet people's needs, we could easily meet everybody's needs in the world today.
And that's true even with the vast increase of population that has occurred.
Even with the vast increase in population and even with energy descent, it's still true.
Yeah. Certainly the vast increase in population has made it so that trying to meet most of these needs has caused environmental problems that we're running up against now too, which is making a lot of the debt crisis problems or a more severe issue that because coming out of it cannot be done in the way that we used to come out of recessions, it seems like. We have to think of a new way out, I guess.
It's true, I think so, although, I think we're at a time in which when we talk about coming out of recession, it's going to be very different. If we're actually going to come out of the recession, it's going to be very different because since we are reaching these limits with energy descent and climate change, we're not going to be able to turn around and say, let's have a green growth economy, because the economy is not going to grow, not in the way we've come out of recessions before. So the future is going to be one of talking about how do you live a quality life with less material goods, and that's the reality of it.
Yeah. So at this point, actually, I'd like to thank Stan for this discussion and point out that there's a number of events coming up in the very near future. We, the people of Eugene, will have a constitutional amendment language discussion at the Oregon Law School on January 18th at 7 p.m. And we'll also on January 20th from noon to 5, we will do an Occupy the Courts event at the federal courthouse. So thanks again, Stan.
No, thank you.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's